Looking through my work, it occurs to me that I've been doing a lot of criticizing and only a little bit of praising. Maybe that's me being cranky and old, or maybe that's because most games are actually mediocre, but to balance the scales, I bring to thee Nier Automata, a PS4 console exclusive by a once revered developer in crisis, whose previous 2 games were one of the worst reviewed in history, and a game that almost single-handedly ruined a beloved Nintendo franchise. Published by a company who's been more known lately for unrealistic sales goals and bloated development budgets than for the good games they've been releasing. There were few reasons to expect this to be a success, but it was a success. The game has sold over 2 million copies and received near universal praise from players and critics alike. So, why? Why was Nier Automata such a resounding success? Well, that ends up being a lesson on scope, depth, having a focused vision, and knowing what's important and what isn't. If you like what I have to say, or how I sound saying it, hook me up with a like, share, and subscribe trifecta. Alright. Nier Automata is a difficult game to analyze. It comes from a developer who's made a few great games, and a pile of games that range in quality from mediocre to embarrassing. It's an open-world RPG with an extremely small map filled with pop-in and low-quality textures, but exceptionally strong art direction and animations produce some of the best screenshots this side of Horizon Zero Dawn. The vast majority of NPC dialogue is text-based, and the English voice acting is often stilted and simple and direct, but the cumulative effect of what the NPCs are saying ends up having a shocking amount of depth when it's all said and done. There aren't all that many enemy types in the game, but the combat is exceptional, finely tuned, and it offers a surprising amount of depth, with gorgeous animations that keep the whole thing going. And finally, the main story of the game isn't anything all that special, but that doesn't really matter because the story ends up not really being the story at all. Nier Automata has an awful lot going on, so the only way I'll be able to keep this from rambling is to narrow my focus a bit. We're going to examine how Nier does less with more when it comes to fidelity, map size, quest design, and combat density. We're going to take a look at what the moment-to-moment Nier experience is, and how the movement system and animations make the game enjoyable whether you're fighting, or simply traversing the map like an android trapeze artist. And finally, we'll examine how Nier crafts a story about identity, existentialism, and empathy, and then does something exceedingly rare by having its mechanics actually reinforce its message and themes. But first, as always, let's get the brief history out of the way. Platinum Games. Hoo boy, where to begin with Platinum Games? Are they the beloved and trusted developer of Bayonetta and Vanquish? Or are they the terrible, awful licensed game hacks who produced Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and a near universally lampooned Star Fox game? Platinum was started in 2009 by 3 developers who'd worked at Clover, a studio who worked on some of Capcom's best games including Resident Evil and Devil May Cry. Now Capcom eventually... Alright, you know what? This is just too complicated to get into here. Let's leave it at this. Platinum created one of the most beloved games of the last generation consoles in Bayonetta, and one of the best third-person action shooters ever in Vanquish, but also Star Fox Zero and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And when it's all said and done, what it really boils down to is Platinum's games have never sold all that well. In fact, they've often sold so poorly that the studio has been teetering on the edge of collapse for years now. It is entirely possible that if Nier Automata had failed commercially, I'd be making a video about the death of the studio and lamenting the fact we'll never get another Vanquish or Bayonetta. But Nier didn't fail. In a year that was positively crowded with huge third-party releases and a seemingly never-ending stream of must-have exclusives, except at Microsoft, Nier still managed to sell more than 2 million copies. Carefully designed. Nier is an open-world action RPG. It's obviously quite a bit more than that, but at its core, anyone who's played an Assassin's Creed game or a GTA game will immediately be familiar with much of what Nier does. It has an open world map broken up into a few visually distinct zones. There are several hub areas where merchants and side quests are. There's an XP bar that fills up until the words "Level Up" flash prettily on the screen. And if that's all Nier was, well, it would have been an embarrassing failure because the truth is, Nier's open world game is almost last generation in its size, its voice acting, and its textures and resolution. Draw distance is shockingly low for this late in the current generation. There's near constant distracting pop-in, and assets are reused frequently. There's nothing here that isn't done better in whatever open-world Ubisoft game you want to grab off the shelf. But Nier doesn't rely on any of those things. and the game remains surprisingly beautiful because Nier seems to have paid most of its attention to what players will actually be looking at the most. This doesn't happen by accident. Every creative act is tension between time, resources, and ambition. And it's clear that Platinum focused their resources and their energies on perfecting the most important parts of the game, and then got the other things to good enough. Big AAA developers are often done in by their ambition and their lack of focus. Earlier this year, Mass Effect Andromeda was a perfect storm of ambition exceeding BioWare Montreal's reach. The game was gorgeous, and there were 7 planets to explore, but huge resources were dumped into creating those systems for a Mass Effect game that released with a cringeworthy story. Andromeda's combat was surprisingly fun, easily the best in the series, but having meme-worthy animations, terrible lip-syncing, and cringeworthy writing in a title that has you spending hours and hours in dialogue trees is game-killing. A game needs to know what its most important aspect is. Nobody ever played a Mass Effect game mainly for the combat. Ever. People play Mass Effect games for dialogue and characters and story. Combat and environmental fidelity should have been lower priorities than dialogue, character development, facial animations, and story. The last open-world action game I played was Assassin's Creed Origins, and at first glance the underlying designs are very similar. Both are open-world action games with a strong emphasis on narrative. In my analysis of that game, I based almost all of my critique around the fact that AC Origins took a huge budget and spread it everywhere without ever deciding what was actually important. Amazing fidelity, average art design. A huge world that was ultimately empty and boring. A high-resolution player avatar with stilted animations, and of course, tons of voice dialogue about a story I can barely remember 2 weeks later. Looking back, I can't even remember if AC Origins had any music outside the title screen. I mean, I'm sure it did, I just can't recall any of it. Nier does not make these mistakes. It isn't a huge game spread too thin. It's small and tight and focused, and it makes sure that the important things are polished. Its environments are small and low resolution, but the art design ranges from fantastic to stunning. Its character models are a little bit hazy, the faces look kinda washed out, but again, the actual character design is arresting, unique, and memorable. The animations are fluid and beautiful. It makes the game a joy to play at all times. Nier also has very similar quest design to Assassin's Creed Origins, or really any other modern open world game. The basic quest has an NPC asking you to help him, her, it, with some mundane task. Find a few items. Kill a bunch of enemies and get a thing. Bring that thing to some other NPC. Hell, it even has 2 escort quests. Nothing new here. But Nier manages to make these tasks compelling because you are always in the world. And Nier's entire world feels just slightly off, just disturbing enough that the player never feels comfortable carving through legions of machines, even as the combat itself is fun. Most of all though, the game continually surprises. The player is constantly confronted with something that confuses them or catches them off guard. Early in the game, many of the machines aren't hostile, so the player isn't sure if any shape they see on the horizon will be aggressive, or passive, or friendly. Beyond even that, the world is filled with NPCs that make the player question their actions. One of the escort quests I mentioned has you escorting a group of machines who are pacifist and want to hold a pro-peace parade. You have to protect them by brutally carving up dozens of other machines who hate their pacifism. It works on multiple levels, like everything else in this game. And importantly, the game reinforces the feel of each zone by having a musical score that perfectly matches the action on the screen at all times. Too many game developers have decided that music is for cutscenes and a few moments when a tone needs to be established. But Nier has music playing almost constantly, and the score perfectly matches the tone of the game. If you're unsure how important the music is to this game, play it again with the sound muted. Look at this example here of combat with the score and combat without it. Speaking of which, it's still a Platinum game. For a game that is heavily about world building and philosophy, man, Nier sure does have a kick-ass combat system. A modern game that intends to be a commercial success has to have combat that feels good, and most great games feature satisfying combat with only a couple of notable exceptions. Looking at you, Bethesda. Nier Automata is a Platinum Studios game through and through. Fighting was clearly a heavy focus of development, and it has its roots in Vanquish and Bayonetta, The action here is fast-paced and challenging, with as much emphasis on its fluent movement system as on the attacks. And like most hack-and-slash games, Nier has a light attack and a heavy attack. But like Bayonetta, though obviously to a lesser degree, there are multiple combos possible, as well as a similar evade ability that allows you to dodge through enemy attacks. It even has a plug-in chip ability that offers a shorter version of the Bayonetta witch time slowdown after a perfect evade. The game's movement is smooth and satisfying, which makes fights against hordes of enemies fun and exciting. Nier also does an excellent job avoiding a severe difficulty spike by slowly introducing the player to different enemy types and combat mechanics. By the end of the game, players will be confronted with a very unique blend of hack-and-slash melee combat and bullet hell dodge-heavy combat. It manages to have a system that gets hectic enough to be on the brink of button mashing, but precise enough to never feel like it's gotten out of control. The camera and controls are tight and responsive, and I never had a combat death feel like it was not my fault. And of course, as with any combat system, animations and sound design are crucial to the experience. Nier's combat animations are almost perfect. Platinum's made its bones crafting fluid combat, and Nier continues the tradition. With a wealth of build options, ranged attacks, pod special attack types, and weapons with different movesets, the combat never gets dull. And that consistent fun extends even to just traversing the world. It feels good to move. I often talk about player movement and how crucially important it is to a game experience. Destiny 1 took a fairly standard shooter and made something truly excellent because player movement felt good. In any game, players will spend lots of time simply moving through the world, so it's crucially important that this basic mechanic feels good and fun. And, as with almost everything else in this game, it's obvious that Platinum spent time and design energy making sure the movement system was satisfying for the player. I hate to be overly harsh here to AC Origins, but it's the last big open world game I played, and it really serves as like an almost perfect foil to Nier. AC Origins has a tremendous map, and traversal is a chore. It's such a chore that the game gives you the option to have your horse autopilot to your map marker. And because the map is huge, you'll spend an awful lot of hours simply going from place to place. Nier's much smaller map is dense with things to see and combat encounters to enjoy, and just running and jumping around the world has been crafted to feel seamless, beautiful, and just damn fun. All three player characters run faster on flat surfaces, and after a few upgrades, sprinting achieves speeds that feel explosive. Jumping is responsive and tight, and the evade button serves as a boost when sprinting or in mid-air. All these systems combine to make a truly special movement system. I never felt bored traversing the map. In fact, it might very well have been one of my favorite aspects of the gameplay, and that points again to having the priorities right. Players in most open world games will spend much, perhaps even most of their time running from place to place with nothing else going on. I'm not sure most developers even consider the possibility of making that simple mechanic fun, but either Nier got lucky, or the developers made a conscious choice to have map traversal be a pleasure. Considering how thoughtful this game is, I have to assume the latter. With what we've already discussed, Nier would have been a successful game. Its open world has fantastic art direction, its character model animations are fluid and beautiful, its combat and world traversal is fun, varied, and satisfying, but none of those things, as well done as they are actually the most important part of Nier. Don't get boring. Nier Automata pulls off the impressive feat of never letting the player get comfortable. Just when you're settling into a rhythm, the game will yank you back to attention with its story, or a surprising mechanic, or its NPC or enemy dialogue. Let's take a moment to make a broad statement about modern gaming. Complex stories are exceedingly rare in games, and they are almost non-existent in games from the largest publishers and developers. Video games aren't paintings or novels. Video games are more like tattoos or commissioned sculpture or custom furniture. They're consumer products first and art second. Studios make AAA games for the publisher with an audience in mind from the start. Games are expensive widgets, and the big budget games are massive investments in time and resources, and they have to answer to investors as well as consumers. As such, they need to appeal to a broad audience to be commercially viable. This means that games need to be simple and easy to understand if they're going to have a narrative focus. As such, the vast majority of big budget games are either hero's journey tales, revenge fantasies, or power fantasies. They almost all include easy-to-hate villains and very rarely have any moral gray area at all. Even the games that market themselves on offering moral complexity rarely do. Bethesda's Fallout and BioWare's Mass Effect games, all of which I love by the way, basically had the same simple story beats, but offer you the choice to choose rude bad guy dialogue or heroic good guy dialogue. Your average shooter only has a slim thread of story to hang a bunch of gameplay on. Nier doesn't so much tell a story as it builds an imagined world to examine existentialism, mortality, empathy, and perspective. Nier begins by just dumping you right into a combat sequence against a huge array of hostile but extremely cute enemy robots. There's a vague story about humanity in the insanely distant future losing a war against an alien invasion and fleeing to the moon. You don't play as a human, however. You don't ever see a human. You don't even hear a human aside from one recorded message urging you to continue killing machines for the glory of humanity. You're an intelligent android with complex emotions made in the image of a creator you never see to fight a war for a people you've never known. Early on, your player character will make repeated comments about how machines don't have complex thoughts and are incapable of emotion or society. But very quickly, that will be proven obviously untrue. The machines you encounter chatter about their fear of death. They flee from before you. Eventually, you'll find several robot societies ranging from peaceful, to ecstatic, to medieval, to finally, in a particularly gripping sequence, a suicidal religious cult. The game isn't communicating with the player through its narrative structure. It's communicating with the player through everything else. We're going to focus on a few particular moments where the game subtly subverts or manipulates your actions. The first time through the game, I immediately attacked when the first boss's name flashed up on the screen, and it was only on my second playthrough that I realized the game had subtly manipulated me and my expectations. The sequence leading up to that boss fight has you slaughtering a huge group of machines before chasing a terrified, fleeing robot who is pleading for his life into an arena. You then fight another huge wave of robots until they all begin repeating, finally, a naked humanoid is born in front of your eyes. A naked humanoid named Adam. Now I'm sure the vast majority of players did what I did and immediately attacked Adam, triggering a pretty fun boss fight. But on my second playthrough, after having soaked in all the subtle messages about the machine's humanity, emotions, and fears, I didn't attack Adam when he appeared. Instead, I just waited for him to attack me, and to my surprise, he doesn't. He stays caught in an idling animation of confusion. Holding his head and swaying slightly from side to side, I walked around him waiting for something to happen, and nothing did. You must attack Adam to progress further. This was so interesting to me that I checked old forums where I found people complaining that there wasn't a pacifist option here. But Nier isn't a game about giving you choices, a common and meaningless buzzword in modern gaming. It isn't even a game about giving you the illusion of choice. You are an android and a soldier, and you have to do what you were trained for. Nier's choice of androids as protagonists allows it to examine the nature of free will in almost every moment. You must attack this naked, non-hostile life form as he stands dizzily holding his head. This lack of choice is a cunning little bit of gameplay that reinforces the entire messaging of the rest of the game. Nier is about big, foundational things like existence, humanity, empathy, life, death, and violence. Ludonarrative dissonance is an obnoxiously scholarly term that refers to a conflict between a game's mechanics and its narrative. Lots, hell, most games have varying degrees of this dissonance because what's fun and what's narratively consistent aren't necessarily the same thing. Famously, the Uncharted games feature a player character who's a charismatic, lovable rogue with a heart of gold, who also happens to blithely murder hundreds of faceless dudes so he can get a piece of treasure. Nier Automata doesn't suffer from ludonarrative dissonance. In fact, its mechanics consistently reinforce the one key motif that the game is communicating to the player: gameplay as narrative. Nier Automata is ultimately a game about perspective. The game starts you out as a typical video game protagonist fighting evil enemies who stand in your way, but it doesn't take long before you're questioning your actions and actually considering the perspective of the enemies the game has set before you. I can't think of any other game off the top of my head that makes the enemy designs so unambiguously cute, and I certainly can't think of any other AAA game that has enemies flee from you begging for their lives. Nier's enemies, in many ways, are the story. NPCs outwardly question the nature of their existence, and much of the game is interacting with machines the player has been told are enemies. In the second playthrough, you'll encounter a few NPCs called Wise Machine. These are found in high places staring out at the sky. If you hack them, you'll hear their internal dialogue questioning the meaning of their lives. Over and over, the game will present you with characters or enemies who force you to consider them actual humans with lives worth living. And most importantly, the idea of perspective is driven home to the player not only through character story and dialogue, but literally through the gameplay itself. Nier repeatedly and literally changes the player's perspective. The first few times this happened, I thought, oh cool, that's different and interesting, but as the game moved along and consistently was changing its perspective, I began noticing how subtly disorienting it was. In any given sequence, the camera will flow from a mid-distance third person to a side-scrolling to a top-down perspective. Within those sequences themselves, the perspective will shift only slightly, making the player have to adjust their actions to the new camera angle. There are dozens of cunning and seamless little perspective shifts, like when the player uses the amusement park ride to get to a previously unreachable area, or after the second boss Simone where you first get to Pascal's village, or almost all of the aerial combat sequences that have the camera shift and tilt. At the beginning of the game, this constant shifting can be disorienting and tricky to adapt to, but somewhere along the line the player has had angle and perspective shift so often you almost stop noticing. This continues to build and ramp up through the end of the first playthrough and into the second and third routes. After the credits roll playing as 2B, the game starts you again, playing as one of the simple, childlike machines, mourning his lifeless brother and trying to revive him by dumping oil onto him. The camera then pulls back and the player inhabits 9S, allowing you to play the campaign again from a different character's perspective. You'll be much more comfortable this time and you'll find yourself noticing the actions and words of the enemy machines more often. 9S lacks a heavy attack but has hacking as a strong option, and hacking unaware or passive enemies allows you to either destroy them, subjugate them to your will, or to inhabit and directly control the game from their perspective. Near the end of the third run through the game, the perspective changes back and forth between two playable characters fighting separate halves of the same enemy. And it's during this sequence that I realized that all the perspective shifts that were so disorienting at first had become expected and easy to react to. The mechanics had stayed the same, but the player had grown accustomed to seeing the world from different angles. I don't think I've ever played a mainstream release that more fully committed to exploring a theme than Nier Automata. Its message is subtly communicated through everything in its world. It takes its main theme of perspective and relentlessly drives it home through camera shifts and character shifts and dialogue and actions until the player has adjusted her expectations and actions and reevaluated everything they thought the game was about. Nier doesn't tell you a story. Nier takes you on a journey of realization. Let's wrap this up. I didn't know what to expect from this game. Platinum is a studio I was and remain a bit skeptical about going forward. And early on playing it, I felt like this was just a pretty good action RPG with slightly dated graphics. There was something uncomfortable about playing it. The low resolution and fidelity felt like a hindrance, and the perspective shifts were cool, but somehow jarring. But by the 10-hour mark, I already considered it an absolute masterpiece. A lesson on how to focus on what matters. A demonstration on how to let a player discover a story rather than passively absorb one. Perhaps the best example ever of having a unifying narrative theme conveyed through not only the game's mechanics, but nearly everything in its design. This game could easily have been a fun hack and slash where you kill robots and evil androids and forget about it 2 weeks later. And if that's all it did, it still would have been pretty damn good. The careful attention paid to combat, movement, and art design alone make it a standout. And in almost any other studio's hands, that's exactly what it would have been. But an absolute commitment to its themes and world make it a game people will remember for a long, long time. I certainly hope Yoko Taro makes another one of these games. And I hope that Platinum gives him and his team a much larger budget next time, because this team clearly understands what matters and what doesn't. They will not spend hundreds of hours making sure water is rendered perfectly before making sure it's fun to move through the world. They won't write some silly trite story without creating a world that makes sense for their narrative. They won't create some ridiculously huge map solely so they can say they made a ridiculously huge map. They'll put that money where it matters. If it was my money on the line, I would have complete trust that every penny would be spent on something important. Nier Automata proves that Yoko Taro and his team are the anti-Ubisoft. Nothing without a purpose and a reason for everything. Alright, I would be totally stoked if you would watch my other videos. And if you watch those videos, it would be totally rad if you liked, subscribed, and especially shared. And if you like, subscribe, and share, I would be filled with a deep, throbbing satisfaction if you would teach me a secret handshake. I have always wanted to be a part of something secret. Bye. Nier repeatedly and literally. Oh, dude, seriously?